The cold came up out of the Missouri ground, first the way it always does in November. It came up through the soles of her shoes, through the thin fabric of her coat, through the bones of her hands that had held 2 heavy suitcases for the last 10 minutes without setting them down. Hadley Thornquist stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of the house she had lived in for 19 years, and she watched a black SUV pull slowly away from the curb. The driver's window was halfway down. She could hear him laughing. Marcus Pemberton was 43 years old, and he laughed the way certain kinds of men laugh when they believe they have just won something easily. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. Cruelty would have required him to think about her, and he did not. It was the laugh of a man who had moved a piece of furniture out of a room he wanted painted. The window slid up. The SUV turned at the end of Cedar Lane, and then there was only the wind and the gray sky and a 73-year-old widow with 2 suitcases standing on a sidewalk she had swept 1,000 times. She did not cry. She had decided weeks ago that she was not going to cry on this sidewalk, not in front of this house, not with the windows of her neighbors quietly watching from behind their curtains. She set the suitcases down. She straightened her coat. She breathed once slowly, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when something was difficult and there was no help coming. And then she picked the suitcases back up and she walked toward her car, parked at the corner, and she did not look back at the house even once. What Marcus Pemberton did not know, what nobody on Cedar Lane knew, what nobody in the small Missouri town of Maplewood would know for another 4 months, was that the rusted 20 by 14 foot shed Hadley Thornquist was about to buy from the county for $5 was hiding something beneath its floor that would end his laughter forever. It would end his marriage. It would end the development deal he had already signed. It would end the version of himself he had spent 43 years carefully constructing, and it would do all of this not through any plan of hers, not through any act of revenge, but simply by being what it had always quietly been, a small abandoned structure on the edge of a forgotten town, waiting for the right woman to find what was buried beneath it. But all of that was still ahead of her. On this particular November morning, Hadley Thornquist was only a widow with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. The wind moved through the dead grass of her old front yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped, and the woman who would soon be holding the key to everything walked away from her old life without making a sound. Hadley had grown up in Hannibal, the youngest of 3 daughters of a man who taught 8th grade history and a woman who spent 31 years behind the counter of a small hardware store on the riverfront. Her father had been the kind of man who could quote long passages of Mark Twain from memory, and who believed that the proper response to any difficulty was to do the work in front of you and stop complaining. Her mother had been the kind of woman who could fix almost anything with a flathead screwdriver, and a level of patience that her 3 daughters had eventually come to recognize as a form of love. Hadley had inherited both qualities. She had not, however, inherited her parents' belief that a steady life was a guaranteed thing. She had married Wendell Thornquist when she was 24. He had been a quiet electrician with broad shoulders and a habit of standing very still when he was thinking. He had courted her for almost 2 years before he had ever held her hand, and when he had finally proposed, he had done it sitting on the tailgate of his pickup truck on a warm September evening with a small ring he had saved for over a period of months. They had moved to Maplewood the following spring. He had taken a job with a small electrical contracting outfit. She had taken work at the elementary school as the front office secretary, and together, in a way that was not glamorous and not ambitious by anyone else's measure, they had built a life. The house on Cedar Lane had been rented from the same family for 19 years. The original landlord had been Harold Pemberton, a retired schoolteacher who still believed that a handshake meant something, and that a tenant who paid her rent reliably for a decade and a half was a person you did not displace lightly. Harold had known Wendell. He had attended Wendell's funeral. He had stood in the back of the small Baptist church in his good gray suit, and afterward he had taken Hadley's hand in both of his, and he had said quietly, "You stay as long as you need to, Hadley. That house is your home," and he had meant it. Wendell had died on a Wednesday morning 11 years ago, a stroke at the kitchen table over a cup of coffee he had not yet finished. Hadley had been at the sink. She had turned to ask him whether he wanted toast, and he had been looking at her the way a man looks at his wife after 37 years of marriage, and then his expression had changed, and then he had been gone before she could reach him, before the coffee cup had finished tipping over, before she had fully understood what was happening. She had survived his death by doing what her mother had taught her to do. She had done the work in front of her. She had paid the rent. She had tended the garden. She had visited her neighbors and attended her church and built a quiet widowhood that was not unhappy because she had refused on principle to allow it to be. She had 2 children. Garrett was 45 now and lived in Tulsa with his wife and 2 teenage sons, and worked in something to do with regional sales for a company whose name Hadley could never quite remember. He called twice a month, sometimes more, and he loved her in the distracted way of a man with his own life. Maren was 43 and lived in Cincinnati and worked as a nurse practitioner in a women's clinic and called every Sunday evening without fail, and was the one Hadley would have told first if she had been the kind of woman who told anyone anything. They were good children. They were not, she had come to understand, children who could solve her problems. She had Doris Calloway, though. Doris lived 2 doors down on Cedar Lane and was 70 years old and had been divorced for so long that she had started to consider it a personal accomplishment. Doris was the kind of woman who said exactly what she thought in the order she thought it, without any softening for the comfort of the listener. She wore her gray hair short and her opinions long, and she had been Hadley's closest friend for 15 years. They had a standing Tuesday coffee at the small bakery on Main Street and a standing Saturday morning at the farmer's market, and 1,000 small understandings between them that had never required words. Doris was, Hadley sometimes thought, the only person left in the world who saw her completely. And then in March, Harold Pemberton died. It happened the way these things happen in small towns. A neighbor noticed his newspaper had not been brought in for 2 days. The neighbor called the sheriff's office. The sheriff's deputy went over and found Harold in his recliner in the den with a paperback novel still open on his chest. He had been 78 years old. He had died by all appearances peacefully, and the small town of Maplewood mourned him in the small ways small towns mourn their kind men. There was a service at the Methodist church. There were casseroles on porches. There was a brief obituary in the Maplewood Sentinel that ran to 6 modest paragraphs, and then 4 days after the funeral, a black SUV pulled into the driveway of the house on Cedar Lane, and Marcus Pemberton stepped out, and Hadley Thornquist met her new landlord for the first time. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall in the way certain men become tall on purpose, as though they have decided early in life that height will be an asset they will deploy strategically. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him too precisely for a man visiting a rental property on a Tuesday afternoon. His shoes were polished, his watch was expensive, his handshake was firm and brief, and his eyes moved across the front of the house with the kind of appraisal Hadley had seen used car salesmen use on vehicles they were planning to mark up. He was Harold's nephew. He had inherited 3 rental properties in Maplewood, along with a small commercial building near the highway. He explained these things briefly, standing on Hadley's front porch without ever quite making eye contact, and then he had said in a tone that was not warm and not cold, but something more efficiently in between, that he would be reviewing the rental arrangements over the coming weeks and would be in touch about any necessary adjustments. He had not asked her about Harold. He had not asked her how long she had lived there. He had not asked her name twice, even though Hadley had given it to him at the start of the conversation, and she had known by the 3rd minute that he had already forgotten it. He had been on her porch for less than 5 minutes, and when he drove away, Hadley had stood at her front window for a long time, watching the dust settle in the road, and she had felt something she had not felt in 11 years. A small, distinct, unmistakable warning, the kind of warning a woman of her age learns to recognize without quite being able to name, the kind of warning that says, very quietly, this is the beginning of something that will not be kind to you. She did not tell anyone about the feeling. She did not call Marin. She did not mention it to Doris over coffee. She told herself she was being foolish, that Marcus was simply a busy man handling an unexpected inheritance, that he would settle into the role his uncle had played, that everything would be fine. She was wrong, and the next several months would teach her exactly how wrong she had been. The Tuesday in late October was unseasonably warm, and Hadley had walked the 4 blocks to the bakery on Main Street to meet Doris for their standing coffee. The bakery was a narrow place with a long counter and 6 small tables and a front window that looked out onto the wide brick sidewalk. Hadley had arrived a few minutes early. She had ordered her usual a black coffee and a slice of pumpkin bread, and she had taken the table nearest the back wall because the front tables had all been occupied when she came in. She had been sitting for perhaps 3 minutes when she heard the voice behind her. She did not turn at first. There was no particular reason to. The bakery was always crowded on Tuesday mornings. People were always talking, but the voice had a quality to it, a particular dismissive confidence that made her hand still on her coffee cup before she had consciously identified what she was hearing. And then she heard her own street name, and then she heard her own situation described in a tone that was neither hers nor anyone else's to describe, and she sat very still and she listened. Marcus Pemberton was at the table behind her. He was speaking on his phone. He was not speaking quietly. "The Cedar Lane property," he said. "Yes, the old woman has been there forever, below market rent. My uncle was sentimental. 18 years on the same rate, can you believe that?" He laughed a short, hard laugh. "I'm going to send her the 30-day notice next week. By Christmas, she'll be out and we can start the demolition prep in January." A pause. Hadley did not move. "The development group is in for $340, Marcus continued. $340,000 all cash contingent on a clean lot. They want to build a 4-unit complex. I'm not letting this one slip because some sentimental old widow doesn't want to read the writing on the wall." Another pause. Hadley could hear her own breathing. It was shallow. She forced it slower. "No, I'm not worried about her," Marcus said. "Where's she going to go? She's 70-something. She'll move in with one of her kids. That's what they do. They make a fuss for a week, and then somebody comes and picks them up. It's not my problem." He laughed again. Something in Hadley's chest moved into a position she did not entirely recognize. It was not grief. Grief she knew. This was something colder and more focused. This was the moment a woman realizes that she has been seen by a specific man as nothing, not as a tenant, not as a person, as a problem to be cleared from a lot. The phone call ended. The chair behind her scraped back. Marcus Pemberton walked past her table without looking down, walked out through the front door of the bakery, and was gone before Doris arrived 4 minutes later. Doris took one look at her face and sat down without speaking. They drank their coffee in silence for a while, and then Hadley told her. She told her quietly and completely exactly what she had heard, and Doris listened, and when Hadley had finished, Doris did not offer comfort, because Doris had never been the kind of woman who offered comfort when what was called for was something sharper and more useful. She said, "Hadley, that little weasel just told you what's coming. Now you have time to think." Hadley nodded. "You hear me?" Doris said. "He just gave you the only gift he's ever going to give you. He told you you're not going to be blindsided. I'm going to be evicted," Hadley said. "Yes," Doris said, "and you're going to figure out what to do because you always do. But Hadley, listen to me. That man is not Harold. Whatever you thought you had in that house, It ended the day Harold died. You understand me." Hadley understood her. She finished her coffee. She walked home in the warm October sunlight. She made herself a simple dinner. She sat at her kitchen table in the early evening with the light coming in low through the back window, and she looked at the room she had lived in for 19 years, and she did the thing her father had taught her to do. She did the work in front of her. She made a list of what she had. She made a list of what she would need, and she waited. The envelope appeared in her mailbox on a Tuesday in early November, exactly when Marcus Pemberton had said it would. He had not knocked. He had not rung the bell. He had simply driven up Cedar Lane in the early morning, slid the envelope into the mailbox, and driven away. The envelope was thick. The letter inside was bloodless. 30 days, the standard language, the polite cruelty of legal forms designed to make displacement feel administrative. Hadley sat at her kitchen table with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she called Garrett. She caught him at lunch in his car outside a sales call somewhere on the north side of Tulsa. He listened to her summary of the situation in the distracted way of a man who was already calculating logistics. He said the right things. He said he was sorry. He said this was outrageous. He said that, of course, she could come and stay with them. And Hadley heard beneath every sentence the small, careful tone of a man hoping she would not actually accept. His wife had her routines. The boys had their schedules. The spare room had been turned into a home office 2 years ago. None of these things were said. All of them were audible. "I'll figure something out," Hadley said. "Mom, are you sure?" "I'm sure. I mean, if it really comes to it, I'm sure, Garrett. I'll let you know what I decide." She called Marin that evening. Marin cried. Marin was the one who would cry. She offered money, real money, more than Hadley would have expected. She offered to fly up the following weekend. She offered to call a lawyer she knew in Cincinnati who handled tenant cases. She offered everything she had to offer, and Hadley loved her for all of it, and Hadley understood that none of it was a place to live. Marin had a 1-bedroom condo and a demanding job and a life she had built carefully and could not simply rearrange to accommodate a 73-year-old mother on 30 days' notice. Hadley told her she would figure something out. She told her not to worry. She told her she loved her. And then she sat on her couch in the lamplight and she let the silence of the house settle around her for the first time since the envelope had appeared. The next morning, she began to look for an apartment. The first apartment was in a building near the highway. The elevator was broken. The hallway smelled like cigarettes and something fried. The landlord was a man in his 50s who kept calling her honey in a tone that made the word feel less like an endearment and more like an inventory tag. The unit was on the second floor. It had a single window that looked out onto the parking lot of an auto body shop. The carpet had been replaced recently, but not well. The rent was nearly double what she had been paying on Cedar Lane. She thanked him and she walked back down the stairs, and she sat in her car for 2 minutes before she could trust her hands enough to start it. The second apartment was technically available immediately, which she should have understood was a warning. The previous tenant had clearly left in a hurry. The walls had marks on them that Hadley did not want to examine too closely. The smell was something organic and unresolved. The landlord, a younger woman with a clipboard and an apologetic expression, had said, "We're planning to do a deep clean before the next tenant moves in." Hadley had said she would think about it. She had not thought about it. The third apartment was clean. The third apartment was small and well-maintained and on the ground floor of a quiet building. The third apartment required 6 months of rent, paid up front, in a single check, before the keys would be released. Hadley had stood in the kitchenette and done the arithmetic in her head, and she had understood that 6 months of rent up front would consume nearly all of the savings Wendell had left behind. It would leave her with almost nothing for the months that followed. She had thanked the landlord, and she had said she needed to think about it, and she had walked back to her car, and she had not cried because she had been holding herself together with such precise care that crying was simply not an option available to her. The fourth apartment was above a bar on the south end of town. The landlord had explained with genuine helpfulness that the unit would be available starting in February. February was 3 months away. Hadley had thanked him, and she had walked back to her car, and she had driven home in the gray afternoon light, and she had understood in a way that did not require any further conversation with herself that she was running out of time. She did not say any of this to Doris. She did not say any of this to Marin. She did not say any of this to anyone because she had been raised by a woman who had taught her that there were certain difficulties you carried alone, not out of pride, but out of practical necessity, because the people around you had their own lives and your burdens were not theirs to bear unless there was no other option. She had 10 days left when she walked into Schroeder's Market on a Friday afternoon. Schrader's was the small grocery store on Main Street where Hadley had been shopping for 19 years. The owner, Bill Schrader, was in his late 60s and knew every customer by name. The store was narrow and well organized and smelled depending on the day of fresh bread or roasting chicken or the particular sweet dustiness of the produce section. Hadley had gone in for a small list of things: coffee, bread, 2 cans of tomato soup, a bag of apples. She had been in the produce section examining a bin of small red potatoes when she heard the voice behind her. "Mrs. Thornquist?" She turned. Marcus Pemberton was standing in the aisle. He was wearing a different suit this time, navy blue, and he was carrying a small paper bag from the bakery section. He was smiling. The smile was the kind of smile a certain type of man uses when he wants to be seen smiling, but is not actually pleased to see the person in front of him. "Mr. Pemberton," Hadley said, "I trust you received the notice." "I did. And how's the search going? Finding something suitable?" He said it loudly enough that 2 women in the next aisle glanced over. He said it the way a man says something when he is performing for an audience. Hadley felt the color come into her face before she could stop it, and she hated him for it more clearly than she had hated anyone in a very long time. "I'm managing Mr. Pemberton," she said quietly. "I'm sure you are. You know, I have to say I admire your composure. Some people in your position would be making a real scene about all this. But you understand how these things work. Some people just don't know when to move on gracefully. You've always struck me as a woman who knows when to move on gracefully." He smiled wider. He waited. He wanted her to thank him. He wanted in some part of his consciousness to be admired for the carefully constructed insult he had just delivered in public in her grocery store in front of her neighbors. Hadley felt her hand tighten on the small bag of potatoes she was holding. She did not speak. She could not entirely trust what would come out of her mouth. And then from the end of the produce aisle, a voice cut across the store like a knife thrown sideways. "Marcus Pemberton, you piece of pavement!" Doris Calloway was standing at the end of the aisle holding a head of lettuce. She was wearing her old red coat and her good walking shoes. Her hair was very gray and very short, and her face had the particular expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity for several weeks and was not going to waste it. "Miss Calloway," Marcus began. "Don't you Miss Calloway me, you greasy little pretender." She walked toward them slowly, with the head of lettuce held in front of her like a small green grenade. "I have known Hadley Thornquist for 15 years. I knew your Uncle Harold for 30. Your Uncle Harold would be ashamed of you. Do you understand me? He would be ashamed. Miss Calloway, I'm afraid I don't see how my private business arrangements are." "Your private business arrangements?" Doris laughed. It was not a kind laugh. Several other shoppers had stopped what they were doing. Bill Schrader had come out from behind the meat counter and was watching with the slow attention of a man who was about to enjoy something. "You're putting a 73-year-old widow out of her home so you can flip a lot for a development deal. There's nothing private about it, Marcus. The whole town knows. The whole town has been watching you since the funeral. And let me tell you something, son. People in this town remember things. They remember who their neighbors were. They remember who showed up at the funeral, they remember who handled their uncle's death with class, and they remember who handled it like a vulture in a suit. Marcus's face had gone a color Hadley had not seen on a person's face before. Not red exactly, something whiter underneath the red. His smile was still on his mouth, but it had stopped meaning anything. "Miss Calloway, I think you should mind your own business. And I think you should mind your manners, Marcus Pemberton, because right now you are humiliating a woman in front of her neighbors in the grocery store she has shopped at for 19 years, and I am not going to stand here and let you do it. Hadley," Doris turned to her, "get your apples. We're paying together. You're coming over for dinner." Hadley looked at Doris. She did not entirely trust herself to speak. Doris's eyes met hers, and Hadley saw something in them she had not expected. Not anger, not pity, something more like recognition. The look one woman gives another when she is saying, without saying it, "I see exactly what is happening to you, and I am not going to let you stand here alone." "Thank you, Doris," Hadley said quietly. They walked to the register together. Bill Schrader rang them up himself. He did not charge Hadley for the apples, though he did it quietly in a way that did not draw attention to itself, the way a certain kind of small-town shopkeeper does small kindnesses for people he has known for a long time. Marcus Pemberton had not followed them. When Hadley looked back at the produce section on her way out, he was gone. She did not cry until she was in Doris's kitchen, sitting at Doris's small round table with a mug of tea in her hands, and even then it was only briefly, and Doris did not say anything about it and did not try to comfort her, and simply sat across from her and waited until Hadley was finished, the way you would wait for weather to pass. "You're going to figure this out," Doris said eventually. "I don't know how." "I know you don't. That's how figuring things out works." Hadley laughed in spite of everything. It was a small laugh, but it was real. "I have 10 days, Doris." "Then you have 10 days. Don't waste any of them feeling small." Hadley nodded. She drank her tea. She went home that evening and she sat at her kitchen table and she made a new list, not of what she had or what she needed, a list of every public office in Maplewood County that she had not yet contacted. There were 6. The next morning, she began at the top of the list. By Thursday afternoon, she had spoken with 5 of them. None had been able to help her. The last was the county assessor's office. That was where she met Pete Hollister. The county assessor's office was on the 3rd floor of the small brick municipal building 2 blocks off Main Street. The elevator was working, which Hadley considered a small mercy. The office itself was a single long room with 3 desks, a wall of filing cabinets, and a front counter that had been polished by elbows for so many decades that the wood was darker in the places where people leaned. The man behind the counter was perhaps 60, with a gray mustache that he had clearly maintained for most of his adult life. His shirt was a faded plaid. His nameplate read, Pete Hollister. Hadley introduced herself. She explained in the bare-bones version she had refined over the past 3 days what she was looking for: temporary housing assistance, emergency shelter referrals, anything the county might offer for an elderly resident facing imminent displacement. Pete listened. He nodded at the right places, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mrs. Thornquist, I want to be honest with you because I think you'd rather have honest than hopeful. Please, the emergency housing programs in this county are funded at a level that frankly embarrasses everyone who works here. The wait list for any kind of placement is 6 to 8 months. There's no fast track. There's no exception for seniors. I wish there were. I really do." Hadley nodded. She had expected this. She had still needed to hear it. "Thank you, Mr. Hollister." She gathered her purse. She turned to go. She was already halfway to the door when Pete Hollister said, "Mrs. Thornquist." "Hold on a second." She turned back. He was looking at his computer screen. He was scrolling slowly through something. He was frowning the way a man frowns when he is trying to remember whether something he is half remembering is actually true. "There's a parcel," he said slowly, "out on Briar Road. The county's had it listed for a while. Old storage structure on a quarter-acre lot. Hasn't sold. I don't think anyone's even inquired in 5 or 6 years. How much?" He looked up at her almost apologetically. $5. Technically just to transfer the deed. Taxes were delinquent for so long, the county just wants it off the books. "What's wrong with it?" He paused. She had liked him before this pause. She liked him more after it, because it was the pause of a man who was choosing honesty over encouragement. "It's a shed, Mrs. Thornquist. It's been sitting empty for a long time. The roof is intact last I checked, but I wouldn't represent it to you as anything more than a metal building on a piece of dirt at the end of a gravel road. There's no utilities, there's no driveway to speak of. The lot is overgrown. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not much." Hadley Thornquist had not had her hopes up about anything in 3 weeks. She did not need much. She needed an address. "Could I see it?" Pete wrote down the parcel number and the address and a rough description of how to find the gravel track off Briar Road. He drew her a small map on the back of a county business card. He handed it across the counter. "Mrs. Thornquist," he said quietly, "I hope you find something better than this. But if you go look at it and you decide you want it, you come back and see me. I'll handle the paperwork myself. I'll make sure it's done right. Thank you, Mr. Hollister. It's just Pete." "Thank you, Pete." Briar Road ran east out of Maplewood, past the grain co-op and the old drive-in theater that had been a field of weeds for so long that nobody under 40 remembered what it had been. The November sky was the color of a wool blanket. The wind moved through the dead grass along the shoulder of the road in slow waves. Hadley drove with both hands on the wheel, the small business card, with Pete's map balanced on the dashboard. She passed a barn that was leaning to one side as though it were considering lying down. She passed a stand of bare oak trees. She passed a mailbox that had been knocked over and never put back up. And then the gravel track appeared on her right, marked by a rusted county stake and a no-dumping sign that had clearly been ignored at some point in the recent past. She turned in. The track was rough. The car bottomed out twice on small rises in the gravel. She drove slowly, the lot opening up ahead of her in the gray light, and then the shed came into view. She stopped the car. She did not get out for a moment. She simply looked. It was perhaps 20 feet by 14. It was made of metal siding, and whatever color the metal had originally been was no longer recoverable beneath a deep blanket of rust that had turned the entire exterior a streaked oxidized red-brown. The roof was corrugated steel, slightly bowed on the south end but visibly intact. There was a single small window on the south-facing wall, and the inside of the glass had been covered with what looked, even from 20 feet away, like a piece of cardboard. The door was metal. It was padlocked. The padlock was old. The hinges were rusted. The whole structure stood alone on a quarter-acre lot of dead grass and frost-hardened dirt, surrounded by nothing but flat Missouri farmland in every direction. Hadley got out of the car. The wind moved her coat against her legs. She walked toward the shed slowly, the gravel crunching under her shoes. She stopped about 10 feet from the door. She looked at it for a long time. It was not a home. It was barely a structure. It was cold and dim and stained and small. It would not be comfortable. It would not be warm. It would not be anything she had ever imagined wanting. But it was hers if she wanted it. It was hers in a way that no apartment in town would ever be hers. It was hers in a way that did not require her to ask permission of any landlord, did not require her to pass a credit check, did not require her to choose between her dignity and her remaining savings. It cost $5. $5. It was on a quarter-acre of land in a county where land was the one thing nobody could take from you once you owned it. She thought about Marcus Pemberton in the grocery store. She thought about his smile. She thought about the laugh he had laughed in the bakery on a Tuesday morning when he had described her to someone on a phone as a sentimental old widow who would move in with her kids and not be his problem. She thought about her father, who had taught her to do the work in front of her. She thought about her mother who had taught her that pride was a luxury and survival was a craft. She thought about Wendell, 11 years gone now, who had once told her in their second year of marriage that the trouble with most people was that they waited too long to do what they already knew they were going to do. She took her phone out of her pocket. She called Pete Hollister. "Pete," she said, "I'll take it." There was a pause on the other end. "Mrs. Thornquist, I want to make sure I'm being clear. It's just a storage structure. I don't even know if the floor is solid." "I understand." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She drove back into town. She parked outside the municipal building. She walked up to the third floor and she went into the county assessor's office and she signed the transfer deed at the front counter while Pete Hollister filled out the paperwork with the slow, careful precision of a man who was choosing not to ask any of the questions he was clearly thinking. The woman processing the documents on the other side of the counter was named Margaret Sutton. She had been working in the county offices for over 30 years, and she had the gray hair and the careful manners of a woman who had seen a great deal of paperwork and had drawn her own conclusions about most of it. She did not look up as she stamped the deed. She did not say anything as Hadley signed her name in the 3 places marked with small red flags. Pete handed Hadley the padlock key, small and brass-colored and worn smooth on the bow from years of handling by whoever had last cared about what was inside. "You're all set, Mrs. Thornquist," Pete said. "I hope you find what you need." Hadley thanked him. She put the key in her purse. She turned to go, and then, very quietly, almost as though it were not meant for her to hear, Margaret Sutton spoke. "Mrs. Thornquist?" Hadley turned back. Margaret was looking up at her now, over the top of her reading glasses, with an expression that Hadley could not immediately read. It was not unfriendly. It was something more careful than that, something deliberate. "You may already know this," Margaret said, "but that parcel has its own history." Hadley waited. "Eliza Pemberton," Margaret said, "Marcus Pemberton's grandmother. She passed in 1991. I knew her a little. She came into this office twice in the 1980s, both times to make sure that parcel was not being transferred or sold to any member of her family." Hadley felt the cold come back into her hands. "She used to say something." Margaret paused, as though deciding how much to share. "She said the way some people say a thing they have said many times. She said that land does not belong to the Pemberton family. She said it like she meant it. She said it like she knew something. Nobody ever asked her what she meant. She passed before anybody thought to." Margaret's eyes held hers for one more moment, and then she looked back down at the paperwork on the counter and stamped the final page with a small, efficient motion, and the conversation was over. Hadley walked out of the office in a kind of slow, careful daze. She got into her car. She sat for a long time with her hands on the steering wheel. She did not start the engine. She thought about Margaret Sutton's voice, about the way she had said those words, about the way certain old women in small towns sometimes pass along things they have been holding for years, waiting for the right person to receive them. That land does not belong to the Pemberton family. She did not know yet what it meant. She would not know for months. But she sat in her car in the gravel parking lot of the municipal building on a gray November afternoon in a small Missouri town, and she felt the very edge of something she could not yet see, and she knew in a way that her mother and her father and Wendell would all have recognized that she had just crossed into a place she could not turn back from. She drove home. She began to pack. The final morning came. Hadley had spent the last 10 days reducing 19 years of life to what could fit in the back of her car and the borrowed minivan Marin had driven up from Cincinnati 2 days earlier. Marin had stayed overnight in a hotel because there was no longer room in the house. She had helped pack the kitchen. She had cried twice quietly in the back bedroom where she had grown up. Hadley had not cried at all. She had moved through the days with the steady, focused efficiency of a woman who had decided on principle that she was not going to break in front of her own daughter and was therefore not going to break at all. The last thing Hadley packed was Wendell's old kitchen table, the table he had hauled in from a neighbor's garage sale 2 decades ago, the table where her children had done their homework, the table where she had paid every bill and drunk every morning coffee and marked every ordinary day of a life she had quietly loved. Marin helped her lift it into the minivan. They closed the doors. They stood in the driveway of the house on Cedar Lane for a moment in the cold morning light. "Mom, don't say it, sweetheart. I know. Get in the van." They drove east out of Maplewood. Marin followed in the minivan. Hadley led in her car. They turned onto Briar Road. They turned down the gravel track, and the rusted shed came into view alone on its quarter-acre in the gray morning light. They unloaded together quietly without ceremony. Marin did not say anything about the shed itself. She had been raised by a woman who did not invite that kind of commentary. They carried the table in. They carried the boxes. They carried the small cot Hadley had bought at the hardware store. They carried Wendell's old toolbox and Hadley's mother's iron skillet and the photograph album from the top of the bedroom closet and the small carved wooden box that had held Hadley's wedding ring for the 11 years since Wendell's funeral. They stacked everything along the eastern wall of the shed. They stood together in the dim interior and looked at it. "Mom," Marin said quietly, "are you going to be okay?" Hadley looked at her daughter, 43 years old, a nurse practitioner, a woman who had built her own life carefully, a woman who was in this moment looking at her mother in the way a daughter looks at a parent when she is trying to memorize her face for reasons she does not entirely want to examine. "I'm going to be okay, Marin. I'll come back next month." "I know you will. Promise me you'll call every day just so I know." "I promise." Marin held her for a long time. She climbed into the minivan. She drove back down the gravel track. The dust rose behind her car and hung in the cold air for several minutes after she was gone. Hadley stood alone on her quarter-acre of dirt. She walked to the door of the shed. She took the small brass key out of her pocket. She held it in her hand for a moment. The padlock was old. The hinges were rusted. The wind moved through the dead grass behind her. The November sky was very gray and very wide, and somewhere far off she could hear the slow drone of a tractor in some other farmer's field. She fitted the key into the padlock. Her hand was shaking very slightly. She steadied it. She turned the key. The padlock released. The door swung outward on hinges that screamed with rust. And Hadley Thornquist, 73 years old, a widow with no home and no plan and no idea of what was waiting in the dim, dusty, cold interior of the small metal building on her quarter-acre of Missouri ground, stepped forward into the dark. The smell came out to meet her first. Old wood, cold earth, the particular staleness of enclosed air that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. And underneath all of that, something else she could not immediately name, something dry and papery, almost sweet, like the inside of an old book that had been closed for decades. Hadley Thornquist stood in the doorway of her new home and let her eyes adjust to the dim light. The only illumination came from the open door behind her and a single pale shaft falling through the high crack where the south wall met the roof. The interior was smaller than it had looked from outside. The floor was wood, planking old, and visibly soft, in places covered in a thin gray layer of decades of dust. The walls were bare metal sheeting, on the inside streaked with the same oxidized rust that covered the exterior, but darker, almost the color of dried blood in places where moisture had pooled and dried. Along the eastern wall ran several wooden shelves, empty except for a few rusted coffee tins and a coil of wire so corroded it had fused into a single solid shape. In the far corner, a wooden workbench sat with its legs slightly uneven, one end propped up by a folded piece of tin. There was a single small window on the south wall, covered from the inside with a piece of cardboard that had been carefully cut to fit. There was no electricity. There was no water. There was no heat. She stood in the middle of it. She looked around slowly. She nodded once, the way you nod when something confirms what you already knew. Then she went back to the car and got her broom. The first 3 days were not about feeling. They were about function. Hadley had decided, before she ever turned the key in the padlock, that she was not going to allow herself to consider what she was doing in any larger sense. She was not going to think about Cedar Lane. She was not going to think about Marcus Pemberton. She was not going to think about the fact that she was a 73-year-old widow sleeping on a camping cot in a metal shed at the end of a gravel track 3 miles east of town. She was going to do the work in front of her. That was all. One small task, and then the next small task, and then the next. She swept first. The dust came up in slow gray clouds that hung in the cold air and settled again on every surface, and so she swept again, and then a third time, until the floor was as clean as she could make it, given that it was a floor that had not been cleaned in possibly 40 years. She scrubbed the metal walls with a bucket of water she had hauled in from the gas station 2 miles up the road. She pried the cardboard off the south window and let the pale winter light come through the grimy glass for the first time in who knew how long. She wiped the window down on both sides until it was clear enough to see through, and then she stood at it for a long moment, looking out across her 1/4 acre of dead grass and frost-hardened dirt at the gray Missouri sky, and she thought very briefly that the world looked different from this angle. Not better, not worse, just different, as though she were seeing it from a place she had never stood before. She bought a tube of weatherproof sealant from the small hardware store in Maplewood the next morning, and she climbed a borrowed step ladder, and she patched the gap in the roof line where the wind had been coming through. She set up the small camping cot she had bought at the hardware store, positioned it carefully away from the soft spots in the floor she had identified by walking the planks one at a time and listening for the give. She unpacked the small propane camping stove that Marin had bought for her at the outdoor goods store in Cincinnati and shipped overnight. She arranged her mother's iron skillet on the shelf above the workbench. She put Wendell's old kitchen table against the east wall under the window she had cleaned, and when she stood back and looked at it, she felt something move briefly in her chest that she did not entirely identify. She did not cry. She had already done her crying. What she felt instead was a kind of focused anger that she had learned over the past month to treat as a tool. It was useful. It kept her hands moving. It kept her mind on the next task. She did not waste it. By the evening of the 3rd day, the shed was as clean as she could make it. She heated a can of tomato soup on the camping stove. She ate it standing at the workbench, looking out the window at the lavender light of the November dusk falling across the empty fields. She washed the bowl in a small basin of water. She set it on the shelf. She sat down on the camping cot, and she pulled her coat tightly around her, and she listened to the wind move across the metal roof of her new home, and she did not sleep for a long time, but she did not cry either, and when she finally did sleep, it was a deeper sleep than she had managed in weeks. The 4th day was the day everything changed. She had decided that morning to deal with the floor. There was a section of planking near the workbench that had begun to bow dangerously underfoot, and she had been stepping around it carefully for 3 days, and she had concluded that she could not continue to do so indefinitely. She had bought a small crowbar at the hardware store along with the sealant. She fitted it into the seam between 2 of the worst planks. She leaned her weight into it. The first plank came up easier than she had expected. It was rotted on the underside. She pried it free and set it aside. She fitted the crowbar into the next seam and pulled. The second plank came up too, and then the third. It was on the third plank that she saw it. She sat back on her heels. The cold air moved through the open ceiling. The light from the south window fell at a low angle across what she was looking at, and at first her mind refused to process what her eyes were telling her, because what was beneath the floor was not the bare Missouri earth she had expected to find. It was not a slab of concrete. It was not joists and dirt. It was a seam, a deliberate seam cut in a rectangle approximately 4 feet by 3, with a recessed iron ring set flush into the wood on one side. The seam had been carefully fitted. The iron ring was old but not rusted through. Whoever had built this had built it to last. It was a trapdoor. Hadley sat on the floor of the shed and stared at it for a long moment without moving. She was not an impulsive woman. She had never been an impulsive woman. She thought carefully about things before she did them, and she considered consequences in advance, and she made small, careful decisions one at a time. She thought now about what she was looking at. She thought about the structural integrity of whatever lay beneath. She thought about the possibility of animal habitation, of collapsed ceilings, of decades of decay. She thought about all of these things for perhaps 45 seconds. Then she set the crowbar down. She reached out with her right hand. She took hold of the iron ring, and she pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked. It was swollen slightly with old moisture and resistance, but it was not sealed. It came up slowly with a small dry sound of wood separating from wood, and as it lifted, a wave of that dry, papery smell she had noticed on the first morning rose up from beneath it, stronger now, almost sweet, and she understood suddenly that the smell had not been coming from anywhere in the shed itself. The smell had been coming from below. The smell had been seeping up through the floor for 3 days, and she had been smelling it without ever quite knowing what it was. She set the trapdoor back against the floor. She looked down. Beneath the shed, perhaps 5 feet deep, was a root cellar. The walls were packed earth that had been lined at some point in the distant past with carefully fitted wooden boards. The boards were old, but they were dry, remarkably dry given everything. The floor of the cellar was packed earth, too, swept smooth at some point so long ago that the broom marks were barely visible. There was a small wooden ladder built into one side, the rungs still solid. The air that rose up from below was cooler than the air in the shed, and drier, and that papery smell was thick and almost dizzying now, the smell of something old that had been kept carefully out of the weather for longer than Hadley had been alive. And stacked inside the cellar, wrapped in what appeared to be muslin cloth, tied with cotton cord, bundle upon bundle, reaching from the earthen floor to just below the trapdoor frame, were shapes that Hadley recognized, even through their wrappings, the way a person recognizes the shape of something familiar without quite being able to name it yet. Quilts, dozens of them, carefully wrapped, deliberately stored, preserved as though someone had placed them there with great intention and with every expectation of returning for them someday. Hadley sat back on her heels at the edge of the trapdoor and looked down into the cellar for a long moment without moving. The cold air moved through the open ceiling above her. The light from the south window fell at a low angle across her hands, which she now noticed were trembling very slightly, not from cold, but from something else, something older than fear and quieter than excitement. She breathed once slowly. She steadied her hands. She climbed down the ladder. The cellar was small enough that she could touch both walls with her arms outstretched. The ceiling was low enough that she had to bend slightly to stand. The smell was overwhelming now, almost sacramental, the smell of stored cotton and old cedar shavings and something else she could not name. She reached out. She lifted the nearest bundle. It was heavy, heavier than she had expected. Even through the wrapping, she could feel the density of the stitching, the substance of what was inside. She could feel that this was not an old blanket. This was not a stored sheet. This was something that had been made with weight and intention and care. Whoever had wrapped this had wrapped it the way you wrap something precious. The cord was tied in a careful double knot, the kind of knot a woman ties when she wants something to stay closed for a long time. Hadley carried the bundle up the ladder. She set it on Wendell's kitchen table in the pale winter light from the window. She went back down. She carried up another and another. She carried them up one at a time slowly, without rushing, because she had already understood somewhere in her chest that what she was doing was something more serious than moving objects. She was raising something. She was bringing something up out of the ground. She did not yet know what it was, but she knew in the way her mother and her father and Wendell had all taught her to know things that she was holding something that mattered. She counted them as she stacked them on the workbench and along the floor. 31. She counted twice to be sure. 31 bundles wrapped in muslin that had aged to the color of old cream, tied with cotton cord that had dried and stiffened but had not rotted. The muslin was clean. The cord was intact. Whoever had packed these had packed them properly. Whoever had packed these had wanted them to last. She sat down on the camping cot. She looked at them for a long time. Then she stood up. She went to the nearest bundle. She worked the cord loose with careful fingers, untying the double knot the way a woman might untie a ribbon on something she had been given. She peeled the muslin back layer by layer, and then she spread what was inside across Wendell's kitchen table as far as the space would allow, and she stepped back and she looked at it. It stopped her breath. The quilt was large, perhaps full, bed size, worked in a pattern Hadley recognized distantly from her own mother's quilting circles 40 years ago, a complex medallion design radiating outward from a central octagonal block, pieced from dozens of distinct fabric squares in deep indigo, rust gold, and cream. The stitching was extraordinarily fine, small, and even in a way that spoke of skill, of patience, of a level of commitment that Hadley could not quite hold in her mind all at once. The fabrics themselves had aged, but had not deteriorated. The colors had softened with time, but had not faded into meaninglessness. The whole thing had a presence to it, a density of intention that made the dim metal shed feel briefly like somewhere serious. Hadley had grown up around quilts. Her mother had made them. Her grandmother had made them. She had a basic vocabulary for the craft. She understood, without having to think about it, the difference between something assembled for utility and something made with a different order of care entirely. What was spread on the table in front of her belonged to the second category. It belonged, she thought, slowly watching the pale winter light move across the fine stitching, to a category beyond even that. She reached out. She touched the edge of the medallion quilt with 2 fingers gently, the way she might touch the hand of a sleeping child. The fabric was cool and dense and slightly soft. It felt like it was alive. She thought for a brief and unaccountable moment that she could feel the woman who had made it. She opened a second bundle, a double wedding ring pattern in colors that should not have survived underground, as well as they had the rings interlocking in a geometry so precise that it generated its own quiet kind of energy. She opened a third, a log cabin pattern executed with a level of mathematical accuracy that Hadley would not have believed possible if she had not been looking at it. She opened a fourth, a cathedral windows pattern, each tiny folded window piece stitched with a kind of precision that would have required a magnifying glass and a level of devotion she could barely imagine. She did not open the rest. She sat down on the camping cot in the middle of the shed, surrounded by spread bundles, and she put her face in her hands. And it was then that she saw it. When she had untied the first bundle, the medallion quilt, something small, had fallen out of the inner folds of the muslin wrapping. She had not noticed it at the time. It had drifted to the floor near her foot and lain there silently while she had been opening the others. It was a small folded piece of paper. No, not paper, something older, something thicker, a small piece of folded parchment, perhaps 2 inches square, browned with age but intact, tied with a single thin strand of the same cotton cord that had bound the bundle. Hadley bent down. She picked it up. She worked the cord loose with shaking hands. She unfolded the parchment carefully, the way you unfold something that might come apart in your fingers. The paper was thin. The ink was faded but still legible. The handwriting was a woman's handwriting, small and careful, and even the kind of handwriting that comes from a person who has been taught to make her letters properly and who has practiced the discipline of writing for a very long time. The message was a single sentence, then an initial, then a year, for the woman who needs them when her time comes. BH, 1889. Hadley sat down on the floor of the shed. She did not understand what was happening to her body for the first several seconds. Her breathing had gone shallow. Her hands had gone cold. There was a sound in her ears that was not a sound, but a kind of pressure, the way a room sometimes seems to compress around you when something larger than you have words for has just walked into it. She held the small piece of parchment in her hand. She read the sentence again, and then a third time slowly, the way you read something you cannot quite believe is in front of you. For the woman who needs them when her time comes. She had not cried during the eviction. She had not cried when Garrett had offered the spare room in the tone of a man bracing for impact. She had not cried when Marcus Pemberton had humiliated her in the grocery store. She had not cried when Marin had driven away that morning in the borrowed minivan. She had been holding it all back with a kind of focused, mechanical discipline for almost 2 full months. She cried now. She cried sitting on the dirty floor of a rusted metal shed on a 1/4 acre of Missouri ground in the pale gray light of a November afternoon, holding a small piece of parchment in her hands that had been written and folded and tied and placed beneath a wooden floor by a woman whose initials she did not know, whose face she had never seen, whose voice she would never hear, but who had reached across 130 years of silence and had said, with a kind of impossible quiet precision, "I see you. I made these for you. I was waiting for you to come." She cried for a long time. She did not try to stop herself. She let it happen the way you let weather happen, because there was nothing else to do, because the thing that had built up in her over the long, terrible weeks of the autumn had finally found a crack large enough to come out through. She cried for Wendell, who had been gone for 11 years. She cried for the house on Cedar Lane that she would never see again. She cried for the woman with the initials B.H., who had folded this small piece of parchment in 1889 and had clearly believed that someone would find it. She cried for the version of herself that had sat at her kitchen table in early November and read a 30-day notice and had not known yet that she was about to be saved by a woman who had been dead for over a century. When she was finished, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat. She stood up slowly. Her knees were stiff. The light through the window had moved. The afternoon was failing. She walked back to Wendell's kitchen table. She stood in front of the spread medallion quilt and the unwrapped wedding ring and the unwrapped log cabin and the unwrapped cathedral windows. She looked at them in the failing light, and she said aloud to no one and to everyone in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "Thank you." Then she went to her purse and she found her phone and she dialed the number she had written down 4 months earlier on a small index card that she kept in her wallet against exactly this kind of moment. She did not entirely know why she was calling this woman first. She only knew that there was no one else she trusted to understand what she was looking at. Cecile Marchetti was a research librarian at the county library 40 minutes east of Maplewood. Hadley had met her exactly once briefly, the previous summer, when Hadley had driven over to use the larger reference collection for a piece of family history she had been trying to verify for Marin. Cecile had been the kind of woman who treated a research question the way a good carpenter treats a difficult cut, with attention, with precision, without any condescension toward the person asking. She had been perhaps 55, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and she had given Hadley her direct office number on a small card and had said in the quiet voice of a woman who meant what she said that if Hadley ever needed help with anything else, she should call. Hadley had not called her in 5 months. She called her now. Cecile picked up on the second ring. "Cecile, this is Hadley Thornquist. We met last summer. I have a research question. It's not a small one. I think I need your help." There was a brief pause on the other end. Cecile did not ask what kind of research question. She did not ask whether it could wait. She did not say any of the things Hadley had been bracing for. She said, "Tell me what you found, Hadley." Hadley told her. She told her plainly and completely, sitting on Wendell's old kitchen table with the medallion quilt spread out in front of her in the failing light. She told her about the shed and the trapdoor and the bundles and the parchment. She read her the sentence on the parchment word for word. Cecile was quiet for several seconds when she had finished. "I'm going to need to see what you have," Cecile said. "I'm going to bring a friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Patricia Holloway. She's a textile historian at the State University. She has spent 30 years of her professional life studying exactly this kind of work. I'm not going to tell you what I think you have until she sees it. I don't want to be wrong. But Hadley, I want you to do something for me. Do not show what you found to anyone else. Do not call any auction houses. Do not put anything online. Do not let anyone into that shed who is not me or Patricia. Do you understand me?" "I understand. We will be there Saturday morning." The phone went quiet. Hadley sat on the kitchen table in the failing light. She looked at the medallion quilt. She looked at the parchment in her hand. She looked at the cold gray shaft of light falling through the south window onto the wooden floor of her impossible new home. She did not move for a long time. Doris arrived 2 hours later. She arrived in her old blue station wagon, bumping carefully down the gravel track, and she parked behind Hadley's car and got out with a foil-wrapped pan in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. She walked up to the shed. She stopped at the open door. She looked inside. She looked at the spread quilts on the table and the floor and the workbench. She looked at Hadley standing in the middle of it. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I brought cornbread, and I brought a bottle of red wine that is probably better than what either of us drinks normally, because today felt like a day for it." Hadley laughed. It was a small, wet laugh. It was real. Doris stepped inside. She set the pan and the bag down on the workbench. She walked over to the table. She did not touch the medallion quilt. She just looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, and then she turned to Hadley, and her eyes were very bright and her voice was very quiet. "Hadley, what in the name of God have you found here?" "I don't know yet." "Whatever you found, Hadley, whatever this is, you hold on to it. You hold on to it with both hands. You do not let go of any of it. You hear me, I hear you." They sat together in the shed for a long time that evening. They ate cornbread and drank red wine out of paper cups by the light of a single battery lantern. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Doris kept looking at the quilts on the table, the way a person looks at something that should not exist. Hadley kept looking at the small folded parchment that she had set carefully on the workbench beside her plate. And outside, the November wind moved through the dead grass of the lot, and the stars came out over the empty Missouri fields, and a 73-year-old widow and her 70-year-old best friend sat in a rusted metal shed at the end of a gravel track, and the whole world somewhere far away was about to start changing in ways neither of them had yet imagined. Cecile Marchetti and Dr. Patricia Holloway arrived together on Saturday morning at 9. Cecile was the first to step out of the car. She was a tall, thin woman with iron gray hair and a navy wool coat and the careful, unhurried manner of a woman who had spent her professional life reading carefully and listening even more carefully than that. Dr. Holloway was perhaps in her early 60s, shorter and rounder, with white hair pulled into a low bun and a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Around her neck on a beaded chain hung a small magnifying loupe of the kind that jewelers use. She had brought in the back of the car 3 reference binders and a soft cotton tarp and a small portable lamp. They came in through the open door of the shed. They did not speak at first. Hadley had laid out the medallion quilt on the cotton tarp Dr. Holloway had brought, draping it carefully across the workbench. Dr. Holloway walked to the workbench. She set down her satchel. She lifted the magnifying loupe to her eye. She did not say anything for almost 2 full minutes. Hadley watched her. Cecile watched her. Outside, the wind moved through the dead grass. Inside the shed, the only sound was the small, dry rustle of Dr. Holloway's hand moving very slowly across the surface of the quilt. Then Dr. Holloway lowered the loupe. She turned to Hadley. Her face had gone a particular color that was not pale, but was something close to it. "Mrs. Thornquist, where did you find this?" It was not a question. It was the tone of a woman recalibrating. Hadley told her. She told her the whole story: the eviction, the $5 deed, the padlock key, the trapdoor beneath the rotted floor. Dr. Holloway listened without interrupting the magnifying loupe already moving again across the central medallion block, examining the stitching, the fabric composition, the seams along the back of the quilt where it had been carefully bound a long time ago by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. "This stitching pattern," Dr. Holloway said, "is consistent with documented work from the Missouri River Valley tradition approximately 1870 to 1890. The fabric composition in this central medallion block. This is a pre-commercial dye, almost certainly natural indigo. You don't find natural indigo in quilts made after about 1885 in this region. The cotton is hand-loomed. The backing is a single piece of fabric, which means whoever made this had access to a large loom or a connection to a weaving cooperative. That alone narrows the possible makers significantly." She moved to the second bundle. "May I?" she asked. Hadley nodded. Dr. Holloway opened the wedding ring bundle. She bent over it. The loupe came back to her eye. She worked through 6 bundles over the next 2 hours. She examined each with the loupe and with her bare hands, turning edges, examining backing seams, holding sections up to the pale light from the south window. She photographed everything with a small, precise camera she had brought. She made notes in a small leather journal. She did not say much while she worked, and Hadley, who had learned over a long life when to let silence function, did not fill it. Cecile sat in the camping chair against the wall and watched her work with the careful attention of a woman who was witnessing something she had not expected to witness in her lifetime. When Dr. Holloway was finished, she set the loupe down on the workbench. She turned to Hadley. She removed her glasses, polished them slowly with a small cloth from her pocket, and put them back on. "Mrs. Thornquist," she said, "I cannot give you a formal appraisal today. That requires documentation, provenance, research, and a certified process I can refer you to. But I can tell you what I believe I am looking at, and I am going to tell you, because I think you have a right to know before I leave this building." Hadley waited. "I believe several of these quilts," Dr. Holloway said carefully, "are the work of a single maker, possibly 2 makers working in close collaboration. They are from the Missouri River Valley tradition. They date to the late 1870s or 1880s. The consistency of the stitching across multiple pieces is, in my professional opinion, remarkable. The preservation is extraordinary. Whoever stored these understood textile preservation in a way that frankly suggests they had professional knowledge or were trained by someone who did. And the quality of the work itself is, in my professional opinion, exceptional, not merely good, exceptional." She paused. Hadley waited. "There is something else," Dr. Holloway said. "I am not certain yet. I want to bring in an appraiser before I say it out loud, but there is a stitching pattern in this medallion quilt, and in 2 of the others I have opened today that I have seen before only in academic references. It is a very particular pattern. It is associated with a single maker whose work has been the subject of considerable speculation in the field of American folk textiles for 50 years. If I am right about what I am seeing, Mrs. Thornquist, what you have found in this shed is going to change a small but significant portion of American textile history." Hadley sat down slowly on the camping cot. "I want to bring an appraiser out here within the next 2 weeks," Dr. Holloway continued. His name is Raymond Whitfield. He is based in Kansas City. He is the best in this region, and I trust him completely. I want him to authenticate what I think I am seeing. I want him to put a formal number on what you have. And then, Mrs. Thornquist, we are going to need to have a very serious conversation about what you want to do with all of this." Hadley nodded. She did not entirely trust her voice. She did not entirely trust her body. She sat on the camping cot in the pale winter light of her new home, and she looked at the quilts spread across the table and the workbench and the floor, and she thought about the small piece of parchment that was now folded carefully in the breast pocket of her coat, and she thought with a kind of slow rising clarity that the woman who had written that note in 1889 had perhaps known something, had perhaps known that on a cold, gray Saturday morning, 136 years later, 3 women would stand in a rusted metal shed and look at her life's work, and they would understand for perhaps the first time in over a century what she had made and why she had made it and who she had made it for. Dr. Holloway and Cecile left in the late afternoon. The light was going, the wind was rising. Doris arrived an hour later, and the two of them ate together in the lantern light, and Hadley slept that night, a kind of sleep she had not slept in over a decade, the sleep of a woman who is no longer falling. It was on a Thursday night in early February that the phone rang. Hadley had been asleep. The phone was on the kitchen table where she had left it. The ring cut through the dark of the shed like a wire pulled tight. She fumbled for it in the cold. The screen was bright. The caller ID showed only unknown. She answered. There was a pause on the other end, a long enough pause that Hadley thought briefly that there was no one there. Then a voice, low, distorted, deliberately disguised, said, "Old woman." Hadley said nothing. "You need to leave that shed. You need to leave it tonight. You need to leave it tomorrow, at the latest. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? You are an old woman alone in a metal building 3 miles from anyone who can help you. You need to leave." The line went dead. Hadley sat up in the dark. She did not move for several seconds. The wind was loud against the metal roof. She could hear her own pulse in her ears. She set the phone down carefully on the kitchen table. She did not turn on the lantern. She sat in the dark and she breathed slowly and she thought. She did not call the sheriff that night. She thought about it. She decided not to. The county sheriff was a man named Holbrook, and she had learned in the past month, in the way one learns these things in a small town, that Sheriff Holbrook had been a fishing buddy of Marcus Pemberton's father for 30 years and was Marcus's godfather in some loose, informal sense, and was not in Hadley's careful assessment the man she wanted involved in this. Not yet. She lay back down on the camping cot. She did not sleep. She watched the small square of moonlight from the south window move slowly across the wooden floor of the shed. She thought about the trapdoor under the floor. She thought about the 31 bundles she had moved 3 weeks earlier, up out of the cellar and into the small new wooden cabinet Dr. Holloway had helped her build along the north wall to store them properly. She thought about the small folded parchment now kept in a clear plastic sleeve inside the cabinet beneath the medallion quilt. In the morning when the sun came up, she went outside and walked around the shed. The marks were on the door. They were small. They were precise. Someone had attempted in the night to pry the door open with a thin tool, perhaps a flat screwdriver, perhaps a small crowbar. The marks were near the new heavy-duty padlock Dr. Holloway had insisted she install in December. The padlock had held. The door had held. But someone had been there. Someone had stood at her door in the dark and had tried to come in. Hadley stood in the cold morning light. She looked at the marks. She did not feel afraid. What she felt was something colder and clearer. She felt the same focused anger she had felt in the bakery on the October morning when she had heard Marcus Pemberton's voice on the phone. She walked back inside. She picked up her phone. She called Doris first. "Doris," she said, "pack an overnight bag. I need you to come stay with me for a few days." There was a pause on the other end. Then Doris said, "I'll be there in an hour." Hadley called Cecile next. "Cecile, I'm sorry to ask. I'd like you to come down for the weekend, if you can. There's been a development. I'll be there tonight." They came. Doris arrived first with an overnight bag and her old shotgun in a soft case, because Doris had been a widow longer than Hadley had been a widow, and she had certain habits regarding her personal safety that she did not intend to discuss with anyone. Cecile arrived in the early evening with a small suitcase and 3 books on textile preservation and a thermos of hot soup. They set up Cecile's air mattress on the floor near the workbench. Doris took the camping cot. Hadley insisted on sleeping in her own bed, which was now a small, proper twin mattress on a low metal frame that she had bought in January against the east wall. That night, the 3 women sat together at Wendell's old kitchen table by the light of the camping lantern. They ate Cecile's soup with the cornbread Doris had brought. They drank coffee. Doris's shotgun leaned unobtrusively, but visibly, against the workbench beside the door. It was Doris who said it first. 3 women in a fortress. That's what this is. That's what we are. 3 women in a fortress in the middle of nowhere with 1 shotgun and 31 quilts and a piece of parchment, and there is not a man in this state stupid enough to walk into this building tonight and live to tell about it. Hadley laughed. It was the laugh she had laughed too rarely in the last 6 months. Cecile smiled. Outside, the wind moved across the metal roof, and the February stars were very bright above the empty Missouri fields, and 3 women in a rusted shed at the end of a gravel track sat together over a kitchen table that had survived 19 years on Cedar Lane and had now found its second life in a place none of them had imagined. Sheriff Holbrook came out the next morning. He came because Cecile had insisted on filing a report, and he came reluctantly in his cruiser with its mud-spattered fender, and he stood on the gravel track with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the marks on the door, and he said the things he was required by his office to say, but he said them in the tone of a man going through motions. He said he would look into it. He said it was probably kids. He said Hadley should consider, given her circumstances, whether a remote rural property was really the right place for a woman her age. Cecile did not let that one pass. "Sheriff," Cecile said, "do you have any reason to believe this was children?" "Well, no, ma'am, I'm just speculating." "Then I would appreciate it if you would not speculate. I would appreciate it if you would take the report and treat this as the attempted breaking and entering that it appears to be. Mrs. Thornquist is a legal property owner. She has every right to expect a serious investigation." The sheriff looked at Cecile for a long moment. He looked at Doris, who was standing in the doorway of the shed with her arms crossed. He looked at Hadley, who was standing on the gravel path with her coat pulled around her. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll file the report." He drove away. Hadley watched the cruiser disappear down the gravel track and turn onto Briar Road. She did not say anything. Raymond Whitfield arrived 2 weeks later on a clear, cold Saturday in late February. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with thinning brown hair and steel-rimmed glasses and the patient, careful manner of a man who had spent 30 years examining things very carefully before saying anything about them. He brought an assistant, a younger woman named Sarah Lindgren, and the 2 of them set up a portable lighting rig and a folding table inside the shed, and they spent an entire day photographing, cataloging, and examining each of the 31 quilts with a thoroughness that Hadley found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. Raymond said very little during the examination itself. He communicated mostly through small, involuntary sounds of appreciation that he did not seem entirely aware he was producing. Sarah took notes on a laptop. The day went long. By the time the light was failing, Hadley had made them coffee twice and a sandwich each, and Raymond had not stopped working except to thank her briefly. He called her 3 weeks later. He told her his preliminary findings over the phone. 23 of the 31 quilts were authenticatable as mid to late 19th century American folk textiles of significant quality. Of those 23, 14 showed sufficient stylistic and technical consistency to suggest the work of a single primary maker. The remaining 8 were likely collaborative works from the same regional tradition. Then he paused. Hadley could hear him breathing. He was choosing his words. "Mrs. Thornquist," he said, "I found something on 4 of these quilts that I want to tell you about over the phone because I think you need to know before we meet in person to discuss the formal appraisal. Tell me." There is a stitched signature on 4 of the quilts. It is embroidered into the binding in a fine thread that is nearly the same color as the binding itself. It is invisible unless you are looking for it and unless you have the right light. I have seen this signature pattern documented in exactly one academic article published in 1978. The signature consists of 2 initials and a small symbol. The initials are B and H. Hadley sat down slowly on her camping cot. "Mrs. Thornquist, the maker whose work is associated with this signature is one of the most sought-after, unidentified makers in the field of 19th century American folk textiles. Her work has been the subject of speculation, of academic dispute, of collector obsession for 50 years. No verified collection of her work has ever surfaced. There have been single attributed pieces. There has been no collection until now. Until now. Mrs. Thornquist, the formal appraised value of the collection, as it stands conservatively, is $214,000. That is what I will put in writing. That is the number I am comfortable defending. But, Mrs. Thornquist, if we can authenticate this collection as the verified work of B.H. with sufficient provenance, the number could go significantly higher. We are talking about a figure that could approach $800,000. Hadley did not respond for several seconds. She could not. The shed was very quiet around her. The pale March light fell across the wooden floor. The 31 quilts were in their cabinet against the north wall. The small folded parchment was in its sleeve. She thanked Raymond. She hung up the phone. She walked over to the cabinet. She opened the doors. She looked at the quilts. She thought about a woman with the initials B.H. who had folded a piece of parchment in 1889 and had said in the only way she could that someone was coming. Hadley thought for the first time in any clear way that perhaps she had been the someone. The next 2 weeks brought their own small wars. Marcus Pemberton, who Hadley had not seen since the grocery store, sent a lawyer. The lawyer was a woman named Patricia Bristol from a firm 2 counties over. The letter she sent was 3 pages of dense legal language raising what the firm characterized as significant questions regarding the disposition of personal property discovered on real property recently transferred by the county for nominal consideration. The letter suggested that there might be grounds for a claim. It suggested in carefully constructed legalese that a partnership arrangement of some kind might be appropriate. Hadley took the letter to Cecile. Cecile took it to a friend of hers, an actual lawyer in Jefferson City, who read it carefully and then laughed for several seconds and then wrote a 1-page response that informed Patricia Bristol's firm that Mrs. Thornquist's title was clean, that her claim to the contents of her property was unambiguous, and that any further correspondence from Mr. Pemberton or his representatives would be treated as harassment. The letter was sent. The harassment stopped. And then 4 days after Cecile's lawyer's letter went out, the phone call came. It was a man named Edward Trask who claimed to be a private collector based in Chicago who had heard through channels he did not specify that Hadley was in possession of a significant collection of 19th century textiles. He offered on the phone $90,000 cash for the entire collection. He could be at her property the next morning with a certified check. He would pay her in person. He would take the collection that day. Hadley listened. She told him she would call him back. She called Doris. Doris drove out within the hour. They sat at Wendell's old kitchen table. Hadley described the phone call. Doris listened. Doris did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Hadley, listen to me. That man is a fraud. I have seen this happen twice with antique dealers around here over the years. He's lowballing you because he's heard about the discovery, and he's hoping you don't know what you have. The cash on hand is the giveaway. No real collector flies into a small town with a certified check for a six-figure transaction without sending an authenticator first. He's a scavenger. He knows you've been alone out here. He knows you've been threatened. He thinks you'll take 90,000 and run." Hadley nodded. "What do I do?" "You call him back. You tell him the collection is not for sale at this time. You tell him in those words, and you do not negotiate and you do not explain. And then you hang up." Hadley did exactly that. Edward Trask was silent on the other end for several seconds after she had finished. Then he said in a tone that was no longer warm, "Mrs. Thornquist, you may not get another offer like this." And Hadley said very calmly, "I think I may, Mr. Trask. Goodbye." And she hung up. That evening, the three of them sat together in the shed again. Doris had brought another bottle of wine. Cecile had driven down for the weekend. The 31 quilts were spread across every available surface, taken out of the cabinet for Cecile to photograph for the documentation file Dr. Holloway was building. The lantern was burning low. The wind was quiet. The Missouri stars were out. Hadley sat at Wendell's kitchen table with her coffee in her hands. She looked at the medallion quilt spread on the table in front of her, the deep indigo and gold catching the lantern light. She looked at Cecile across the table, her gray hair pulled back, her glasses slightly fogged from the steam off her own coffee cup. She looked at Doris in the camping chair near the door, her shotgun still leaned beside her, her face soft with wine and lantern light. Hadley said very quietly, "She waited 130 years. Cecile looked at her. "They are not going to take her again," Hadley said. "Not in my house, not on my watch, not while there is breath in any of the three of us. They are not going to take her." Doris reached across the kitchen table. She put her hand on Hadley's hand. "No," Doris said, "they are not." The lantern burned low. The wind was quiet. And outside on the cold, dark fields of central Missouri, the stars wheeled slowly above three women in a rusted metal shed who did not yet know what was coming, but who were no longer alone in any way that mattered. The formal appraisal arrived in a sealed envelope on a Tuesday in mid-March. Raymond Whitfield had driven it down himself from Kansas City, which was something he did not do for clients ordinarily, but he had driven it down for Hadley because he had begun over the course of his work with her to treat the entire matter as something that required a certain kind of personal respect. He sat at Wendell's old kitchen table in the shed with his coffee, and he opened the envelope and he laid the bound document in front of her, and he turned it so she could read it. The conservative figure was $214,000. The provisional figure contingent on verified attribution to the maker known in the academic literature as B.H. was just under $800,000. Raymond had attached a separate document of 9 pages outlining the documentation pathway that would be required to move from the conservative figure to the provisional one. Hadley read it slowly. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at Raymond across the table. She thanked him quietly in the careful, even tone of a woman who had decided before she ever opened the envelope that she was not going to let any sum of money rearrange her in front of another person. He had said gently, "Mrs. Thornquist, do you understand what this means?" And she had said, "I understand exactly what this means, Mr. Whitfield. Thank you for driving down." He had left an hour later. Hadley had sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after he was gone. The afternoon sun had moved slowly across the wooden floor. The quilts were in the cabinet. The parchment was in its sleeve. The wind moved gently against the metal walls of the shed she now owned outright on a quarter-acre of Missouri ground that no one could take from her. She did not call Garrett. She did not call Marin. She did not call Doris. She sat with it alone for several hours, the way she had been taught by her mother and her father to sit with large things before she began to act on them. And when the light had failed completely, she got up and she heated a can of soup, and she ate it standing at the workbench in the lamplight, and she thought about the next 4 months very carefully, the way her father had once taught her to think about a difficult crossing in a difficult season. She did not know yet that the story was about to leave Maplewood entirely. She did not know yet that a woman she had never met was about to write a single newspaper article that would put her face on a screen in front of 17 million strangers in less than a week. She did not know yet that the truth about Briar Road, the truth that Margaret Sutton had quietly hinted at in November in the county assessor's office, was about to come up out of the records the way the quilts had come up out of the floor. She only knew that the next thing she had to do was eat her soup and clean her bowl and go to bed and trust that whatever was coming would arrive in its own time and would find her ready. Glenda Brennan was a feature writer for a regional weekly out of Jefferson City. She was 50 years old, divorced mother of one grown son, and she had been writing human interest features for the same publication for 19 years. She had heard about Hadley Thornquist's quilt collection through a single offhand mention in a university newsletter piece that Dr. Patricia Holloway had written for an academic textile preservation society. The piece had been 3 paragraphs long. It had not named Hadley. It had not named the town. It had referred only to a recently authenticated collection of significant 19th century folk textiles discovered in central Missouri by a private property owner. Glenda Brennan had read those 3 paragraphs at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She had set her coffee down. She had reached for her notebook. It took her 4 days to find Hadley. She did not find her through any source she would later be willing to identify. She arrived at the gravel track on Briar Road on a Thursday afternoon in late March in a small silver sedan, and she parked behind Hadley's car, and she walked up to the shed with a notebook in one hand and her car keys in the other, and Hadley met her in the doorway with the careful expression of a woman who had been expecting someone eventually and was not entirely surprised that the someone had arrived. Glenda introduced herself. She did not ask for an interview at the door. She said instead that she wanted to understand what had happened here and that she would happily wait outside while Hadley decided whether she wanted to talk to her at all. Hadley looked at her for a long moment. She invited her in. They sat together at Wendell's kitchen table for almost 4 hours. Hadley told her the entire story, not the sensational version, the complete one, the eviction, the $5 deed, the padlock key, the trap door, the parchment, the 3 women in the shed in February with a shotgun against the workbench, the lawyer's letter from Marcus Pemberton's firm, the fraudulent collector from Chicago who had offered $90,000 cash, the midnight phone call, the marks on the door. Glenda listened. She took careful notes. She did not interrupt. She did not lead. She let Hadley speak the way a good writer lets a person speak when the person has been waiting without knowing they had been waiting for someone to listen properly. When Hadley was finished, Glenda asked one question. "Mrs. Thornquist," she said, "do you have any sense of who the woman was? The one who made the quilts, the BH on the parchment?" Hadley shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "We are looking. Cecile and Dr. Holloway are looking. The records from this area in that period are difficult, but we will find her. I am not going anywhere until we do." Glenda Brennan wrote the article that night. It ran on the following Thursday, on the front page of the Regional Weekly, under a headline that the editor had chosen, and that Hadley would later think was both more honest and more dangerous than the editor had perhaps intended. Evicted at 73, she bought a rusted $5 shed. What she found beneath the floor has brought her cruel landlord to his knees. The article ran 1,600 words. It told the story plainly. It named Marcus Pemberton. It named the development deal. It quoted Hadley's lawyer's response letter. It included a single photograph of Hadley standing in front of the open door of the shed, with the medallion quilt visible behind her on the workbench, the deep indigo and gold catching the light. Within 48 hours, the article had been picked up by 3 regional outlets, 1 national lifestyle publication, and a syndication service that placed it in newspapers in 14 states. By the end of the first week, a national morning news program had aired a 4-minute segment on it. The phone calls began. Collectors, museum curators, a documentary filmmaker, 2 book agents, a producer from a public radio program, a graduate student in Texas writing a dissertation on undocumented women, textile makers of the postbellum South. And on the 3rd day after the article ran, in the early evening, Hadley received a phone call from a woman who introduced herself in a quiet, careful voice as Dr. Onwin Talbot, a historian at a small private college in St. Louis. Dr. Talbot said that she had read the article. She said that the description of the maker's stitching and the date on the parchment and the location of the property had together caused her to spend the past 48 hours in the archives of 3 different county courthouses. She said that she had found something. She said that she would like to drive down to Maplewood with Hadley's permission and present what she had found in person. Hadley said yes. Marcus Pemberton came back on a Saturday morning in early April. Hadley saw the SUV coming up the gravel track before he had finished the turn from Briar Road. She was outside in the small bed she had cleared along the south wall of the shed, transplanting seedlings she had started in cardboard egg cartons on her workbench. She did not stand up immediately. She did not move toward him. She watched the SUV come slowly up the gravel, watched it bottom out on a small rise, watched the dust rise behind it in the cool morning air. He parked. He got out. He looked smaller than she remembered. He was not physically smaller. He was still the same broad-shouldered man in the same category of expensive coat, but there was something compressed about him now, something that suggested the period since the article had run had not been kind. His suit was the same charcoal. His shoes were polished, but his face had a tightness around the eyes that she had not seen in him in November, and his hands moved differently when he walked the way the hands of a man move when he has been holding something heavy for too long and is no longer entirely sure how to set it down. He stopped at the edge of the seedling bed. He looked at the shed. He looked at the new second window she had cut into the north wall in January. He looked at the small raised vegetable bed she had built along the south wall. He looked at the neat gravel path she had laid stone by stone from the parking area to the front door. He looked at the wooden cabinet visible through the open door where the quilts now lived. He looked finally at her. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thornquist." Hadley set down her trowel. She did not stand up. She did not need to. She turned on her heels slowly, still kneeling at the edge of the bed, and she looked up at him in the cool spring sunlight, and she did not say anything. He shifted his weight. He cleared his throat a second time. "Mrs. Thornquist, I wanted to come out here and have a conversation with you. I felt that given the recent press coverage and given the way certain elements of our prior interactions have been characterized publicly, I thought it would be appropriate and possibly mutually beneficial to discuss whether there might be a path forward that addresses both of our interests." Hadley listened. She did not respond. "What I mean to say is that there are some questions, legal questions about the disposition of personal property discovered on real estate that was transferred for nominal value by the county. My understanding is that this is a complex area of property law. I have consulted with counsel. Their reading is that there may be grounds for a discussion about a partnership arrangement, a reasonable percentage, something that recognizes the inheritance dimension of the property given that it was previously associated with my family." He stopped. He waited. He had clearly rehearsed the sentence on the drive out. He had clearly hoped that delivering it in person would carry weight that the lawyer's letter had not carried. Hadley wiped her hands slowly on the small cloth tucked into the waistband of her gardening apron. She stood up. She did not hurry. The cool April breeze moved through the dead grass at the edge of the lot. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said in the same calm, even voice she had used on the phone to Edward Trask, the same voice her mother had used on the day in 1962 when she had told her husband that the hardware store would survive the recession because they were going to make it survive, the same voice that women in her family had used in difficult moments for 4 generations. Mr. Pemberton? Yes. You said something on a phone call in October. You were sitting at a table in Vincent's Bakery on Main Street. You were 2 tables behind me. You did not know I was there. Do you remember what you said? His face changed. It changed very slightly, but it changed. I am not sure what you are referring to. You said, the Cedar Lane property. The old woman has been there forever, below market rent. My uncle was sentimental. 18 years on the same rate, can you believe that? You said you were going to send me the 30-day notice the following week. You said that by Christmas, I would be out. You said the development group was in for $340,000. You said, where was I going to go? You said I was 70-something. You said I would move in with one of my kids. You said that was what we do. You said we make a fuss for a week, and then somebody comes and picks us up. You said it was not your problem. She stopped. She let the words sit in the air between them. The wind moved gently in the dead grass. Somewhere far off, a tractor was running. Marcus Pemberton did not respond. You said all of that on a Tuesday morning in October at Vincent's Bakery, Mr. Pemberton. You said it loudly. You said it with confidence. You said it with the absolute certainty of a man who believed there was no one in the world who could touch him. And I am telling you now that I heard every word of it, and so did the woman behind the counter, and so did the man at the corner table reading the paper, and so did everyone in that bakery, and so does, by this point, most of the state of Missouri. She paused. You are standing on my property, Mr. Pemberton. You are standing on a 1/4 acre of Missouri ground that I paid $5 for. That ground is mine. The shed is mine. The cabinet in that shed is mine. Everything in that cabinet is mine. The deed is clean. The title is clean. My attorney has confirmed all of it in writing. There is no partnership conversation to have. There is no percentage to discuss. There is no path forward, as you put it, that involves you and me and a shared interest of any kind. There never was. There never will be. He started to speak. She raised one hand. I am not finished. I want you to listen, because I am going to say this to you once, and I am not going to say it again. You will not come back here, Mr. Pemberton. You will not call. You will not send another lawyer. You will not stand on my property again. If you do, I will take every word of what you said in that bakery and every detail of the letter your firm sent in February and every part of the timeline of your conduct over the past 6 months, and I will hand all of it to Ms. Brennan at the Jefferson City paper, and I will let her write the second article. And the second article, Mr. Pemberton, will not be a human interest feature. It will be a profile of you. She set her hands carefully back on her hips. The wind moved her hair across her forehead. She did not move it back. Now, you are going to leave my property, and you are going to get into that SUV, and you are going to drive back down the gravel track, and you are not going to come back. He stood there for another moment. His face had gone the same color it had gone in the bakery, that whiteness underneath the red. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He turned around. He walked back to the SUV without looking at her. He got in. He turned the engine over. He drove back down the gravel track slowly, the dust rising behind him in the cool morning light, and Hadley watched him go until the SUV had turned onto Briar Road and disappeared from view. Then she knelt back down at her seedling bed. She picked up her trowel. She finished transplanting the seedlings. Her hands did not shake. Dr. Onwin Talbot arrived on the following Tuesday afternoon. She was perhaps in her late 40s, slim with dark red hair cut to her shoulders, and the careful posture of a woman who had spent her adult life in archives. She brought with her a soft leather case that contained, she explained, copies of 9 documents that she had located in the past 3 weeks in the county courthouse archives in 3 separate Missouri counties. She brought also a single original photograph, which she had retrieved from the special collections of the Historical Society of an adjacent county, and which she had been given permission to bring on the condition that Hadley would not photograph it or distribute it until the Historical Society had completed its formal documentation of the find. She laid the documents on Wendell's kitchen table. She laid the photograph on top. It was a tintype, a small one, perhaps 4 inches by 3, mounted in a thin cardboard frame that had yellowed at the edges. The image was faded but clear. It showed a woman standing in front of a small wooden farmhouse. She was black. She was perhaps 50 years old. She wore a long, dark dress with a white collar and a small, dark hat, and she held in her hands, draped across her arms, in front of her, a folded quilt. The quilt was clearly a medallion pattern. The geometry of the central block was unmistakable. Hadley sat down slowly at the table. She looked at the photograph. Her name was Beatrice Harlan, Dr. Talbot said quietly. She was born into slavery in Kentucky in 1836. She was freed in 1863. She came to central Missouri after the war in 1868 with her husband Jonas Harlan, a freedman from the same plantation. They settled in this county. They bought a 1/4 acre of land on what is now Briar Road for $42. She paused. She moved the photograph aside. She laid out the documents. This is the original deed of sale dated October 1868. This is the tax record from the county for 1869 in Beatrice Harlan's name. This is a record of land improvements filed in 1872. They built a small farmhouse. They began a small farm. Jonas Harlan worked by all accounts as a laborer in town. Beatrice Harlan was a quilter. By the late 1870s, she had begun to sell her work locally. By the mid-1880s, her work was being purchased by collectors as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. There are 3 documented sales in the historical record. The amounts she received are remarkable for the period. She was, by every measure I can locate, one of the finest folks textile makers working in the Missouri River Valley in the late 19th century. Hadley listened. She did not speak. Dr. Talbot moved another document forward. In 1890, a man named Josiah Pemberton filed a claim against the Harlan property. He alleged that the original deed of sale was invalid because of a clerical error in the conveyance from the previous owner. The previous owner had died in 1888. There was no one to dispute the claim. The case was heard by a circuit court judge in this county on November 14, 1890. The judge ruled in Pemberton's favor. He awarded the land to Pemberton. Beatrice and Jonas Harlan were given 30 days to vacate the property. Hadley's hand had gone still on the table. The legal mechanism, Dr. Talbot said carefully, was a clerical error doctrine that was used in this period by white claimants to dispossess black landowners across the South and the lower Midwest. It was used in this case. There is no question from the documentation I have reviewed that the claim was fraudulent. The deed was clean. The Harlan family had paid every tax assessed against the property for 22 years. Josiah Pemberton was a local landowner with significant connections. The judge was his cousin by marriage. The case took less than 4 hours. The Harlans were given 30 days to leave. Hadley sat very still. Jonas Harlan died in February of 1891. The cause of death listed on the county record is heart failure. Beatrice Harlan died in May of 1891. The cause of death listed is pneumonia. They are buried in unmarked graves in the colored section of the Maplewood Public Cemetery. I have visited the section. The plots have been documented by a local heritage group. Dr. Talbot paused. She looked at Hadley across the table. Mrs. Thornquist, the parchment you found beneath the floor was dated 1889. The Harlans received their eviction notice in November of 1890. Beatrice Harlan stored 31 of her finest quilts in a root cellar beneath the floor of her farmhouse sometime in the year before the eviction. She wrapped them in muslin. She tied them with cotton cord. She left a note. And then she and her husband were forced off the land they had owned for 22 years, and they died within a year of each other, and the farmhouse eventually collapsed, and someone sometime in the 20th century built the metal shed on the foundation. And the quilts she had hidden, they stayed where she had left them. Dr. Talbot stopped. The shed was very quiet. The April sunlight fell at a low angle through the south window. Hadley sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the documents on the kitchen table and looked at the small tintype of Beatrice Harlan standing in front of her small wooden farmhouse holding a folded medallion quilt across her arms, and she could not speak for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. And Marcus Pemberton. Josiah Pemberton is Marcus Pemberton's great-great-grandfather, Dr. Talbot said. The land passed through the Pemberton family for 2 generations. It was sold to the county in 1958 for back taxes after Marcus's grandfather refused to pay the assessment. The grandfather, Eliza Pemberton. Eliza Pemberton refused to pay the assessment. She did. According to the county records, she allowed the property to lapse deliberately. There is a letter in the file. She wrote to the county treasurer in 1956. She said, "I will not pay another dollar against that land. The land does not belong to the Pemberton family. It never did. Do with it what you will." Hadley closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about Margaret Sutton leaning over the front counter of the county assessor's office in November, in a quiet voice telling her without telling her. She thought about a woman named Eliza Pemberton, who had died in 1991 and who had spent 50 years of her adult life quietly trying to give back something that had been taken by her husband's family before she had ever been born. She thought about Beatrice Harlan standing in front of her farmhouse in 1885 with a folded quilt across her arms, and she thought about the small, careful sentence on the parchment, "For the woman who needs them when her time comes." She opened her eyes. She looked at Dr. Talbot across the table. She said very quietly, "What do we do?" Dr. Talbot smiled gently. "That Mrs. Thornquist is what I came down here to figure out with you." The work of the next several months was not glamorous. It was not the work of newspaper articles or television segments or auction house dramas, although all of those things would come too in their own time. It was the work of 3 women at a kitchen table over many long afternoons. Hadley, Cecile, Dr. Talbot. Sometimes Doris joined them, and sometimes Dr. Holloway drove down from the university, and sometimes Raymond Whitfield called in from Kansas City. But the core of it was the 3 women at the table with the documents spread between them and the photographs on the wall behind them, and the slow, steady work of building from the records and the parchment and the tintype and the stitching and the unmarked graves, a complete account of the life and the work and the dispossession of Beatrice Harlan. The Historical Society of an adjacent county committed staff time to the documentation effort. The State Historical Society of Missouri sent a curator down for a 2-day visit and left committed to acquiring 3 of the museum-grade quilts for permanent exhibition under Beatrice Harlan's name. A small private foundation in St. Louis offered to fund the publication of a monograph on Beatrice Harlan's work to be co-authored by Dr. Holloway and Dr. Talbot. A documentary filmmaker who had reached out after the first article was given measured cooperation on conditions Hadley had Cecile draft carefully in advance. A university press in Kansas began discussions about a book. Hadley made a series of decisions in April and May after long, careful conversations with Cecile, Doris Marin, and Garrett. The conversations with her children had been the hardest in their own way, not because Garrett or Marin had wanted anything from her. They had not. Both of them, when she had finally explained the appraisal figures and the auction interest and the museum interest, had been silent on the phone for long moments, and had then said in their separate ways that they wanted only what she wanted. The hard part had been simpler. The hard part had been telling them that she had not told them sooner. The hard part had been the months of silence. Garrett had cried. Hadley had not heard her son cry since he was perhaps 8 years old. He had cried quietly into the phone on a Wednesday evening in April, and he had said, "Mom, I should have come up. I should have come up the day you got the notice. I should have been there." And Hadley had said, "Garrett, you are coming up now. That is what matters. You are coming up now." And he had said, "I am Mom. I am coming up. Marin and I are coming up together. We are going to be there." They came in early October. Garrett flew in from Tulsa and rented a car from the airport. Marin drove up from Cincinnati. They arrived within an hour of each other on a clear, bright Saturday morning, and Hadley met them in the gravel turnaround in front of the shed, which by then was not exactly a shed anymore, although the metal walls were still recognizably what they had always been. The work on the building had taken 6 months. Hadley had hired a local contractor named Dwayne Foster on the recommendation of a friend of Cecile's, and Dwayne had worked alongside Hadley for the duration, and the two of them had transformed the structure together into something that was still recognizably itself the metal bones and the corrugated roof and the basic geometry of a working building, but that was now insulated, plumbed, wired, and genuinely livable. She had kept the original workbench. She had kept the trapdoor fitted with proper hinges and a new ring pull, which now covered the cleaned and lined root cellar, where she stored, on proper shelving, the 14 quilts she had decided to keep. She had refinished the oak floor she had laid herself during the winter. She had installed 2 more windows. She had put her mother's kitchen table against the east wall under the north window, where the light was best in the morning. Garrett stood in the doorway of the building. He looked around slowly. He looked at the floor. He looked at the windows. He looked at the cabinet against the north wall, which now housed only the 10 quilts Hadley was still deciding about. He looked at the framed photograph of Beatrice Harlan that Hadley had hung above the kitchen table, the small tin-type copy Dr. Talbot had presented to her as a gift in June. He turned to his mother. He did not speak for a moment. His face moved through several things. Then he said very simply, "Mom." He walked over to her. He put his arms around her. He held her for a long time. He was a large man. He had been a large man since he was 16. He held his mother in the doorway of the small home she had built with her own hands, and he said into the top of her gray hair, "I should have come sooner. You are here now, Garrett. I should have come sooner. You are here now?" Marin stood at the kitchen table. She was looking at the photograph of Beatrice Harlan. Her face was very still. Hadley walked over to her gently, and she put her hand on her daughter's shoulder, and Marin turned and put her face against Hadley's neck, the way she had when she was 8 years old, and she did not cry, but she stood there for a long moment with her face against her mother's neck, and then she stepped back and wiped her eyes once, and she said, "Mom, I want to know everything." So Hadley told them everything. They sat at the kitchen table. She made coffee on the new stove. She told them the whole story from the November morning in the bakery, through the arrival of the eviction notice, through the 4 apartments, through the conversation with Pete Hollister, through the padlock key, through the trapdoor, through the parchment, through the 3 women in the fortress, through Marcus Pemberton on the gravel path. And then she told them about Beatrice Harlan. She showed them the tintype. She read them the parchment. She walked them over to the cabinet and showed them the quilts. Garrett did not say anything for a long time. Marin held the parchment in its plastic sleeve and looked at it and finally set it down on the table very gently, as though she were afraid of harming it. Doris and Cecile arrived in the late afternoon. Doris brought another pan of cornbread. Cecile brought a bottle of red wine that was again better than what any of them ordinarily drank, because the day called for it. They sat at the table, all 6 of them, in the warm October light, and they ate, and they talked, and they laughed, and Garrett asked Doris what she had really thought of her mother on the day Doris had defended Hadley in the grocery store, and Doris told him in some detail, and Marin laughed until she cried. At one point in the long evening, Garrett went outside alone. Hadley watched him through the south window. He walked across the lot. He stood at the edge of the property line. He looked out at the empty Missouri fields, the same fields that Beatrice and Jonas Harlan had looked at 135 years earlier from the doorway of a small wooden farmhouse that no longer existed. He stood there for almost 10 minutes. When he came back, his eyes were red. He did not say anything about it, and Hadley did not ask. The community center event was Cecile's idea. She had been quietly organizing it for 6 weeks. It was held on a clear, cold evening in late October in the small meeting hall of the Maplewood Community Center under the modest banner of a gathering for women in transition, which Cecile had named carefully on purpose to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention and to draw the right kind. 43 women came. Some drove more than an hour. They sat in folding chairs with coffee cups in their hands and the careful expressions of people who were hoping to hear something true. Hadley stood at the small lectern at the front of the room. She did not have notes. She had decided on the drive over that she was not going to use notes. She had Doris on one side of her sitting in the front row in her good coat and Cecile on the other side with the small tintype of Beatrice Harlan in a frame on the lectern beside her hand. She told them the truth. She told them about the eviction notice in the mailbox. She told them about the 4 apartments that were not possible. She told them about the conversation with Pete Hollister at the county assessor's office. She told them about the padlock key worn smooth on the bow. She told them about the smell of old paper and the trapdoor in the floor. She told them about the 31 bundles. She told them about the parchment. She told them about Beatrice Harlan. She told them when she came to that part slowly. She held the small tintype up so the room could see it. She told them about the deed of 1868 and the fraudulent claim of 1890 and the unmarked graves in the colored section of the Maplewood Public Cemetery. She told them about Eliza Pemberton, who had quietly refused for 50 years to participate in the keeping of what her husband's family had taken. She told them about the 3 quilts that were now on permanent display at the State Historical Society of Missouri with proper provenance documentation under the name of their maker. She told them about Marcus Pemberton. She told them in the careful, even tone of a woman who had decided she would say it only once and only here, that the same family that had filed the fraudulent claim in 1890 had attempted 134 years later to displace another woman from the same piece of land using a different but related set of legal mechanisms and had failed and would not be permitted to do anything like it again. The room was very quiet. She told them about the fun. She told them that a portion of every sale from the auction quilts, which had finally closed in September for a total of $387,000, had gone into the Beatrice Harlan Foundation, which she and Cecile had established in July and which provided emergency housing assistance for women over 60 in the region facing displacement. She told them that the foundation had already helped 4 women that summer. She told them that the foundation would help more. She told them what she actually believed. "I am 75 years old," she said. "I live in a building that I built with my own hands on a piece of land that I paid $5 for. I have never been more awake in my life. I am not telling you this to inspire you. I am not telling you this to make you feel anything in particular. I am telling you this because there is a thing I have learned in the last 2 years, and I think some of you may need to hear it. The worst thing that happened to me turned out to be the thing that showed me everything I actually was. The shed did not make me. The shed found me. The woman who was required to do what I have done was already there inside the ordinary life I had been living, waiting under the surface, needing only to be given no other option. I do not recommend waiting for an eviction notice to find out who you are. I am telling you not to make yourself small in the hope that smallness will be rewarded with safety, because it will not, and because you are worth so much more than the version of yourself that fits inside someone else's idea of what you should be. Beatrice Harlan was forced off her land in 1890. She knew it was coming. She hid her work beneath the floor. She wrote a note. She left it for someone. She did not know who. She did not know when. She trusted that someone would come. And she was right. Someone did come. It took 135 years, but she was right. She paused. She looked out at the 43 women in folding chairs. You are worth coming for. You are worth being found. You are worth keeping yourself safe long enough that the world has time to come around to what you have always been. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Do not let anyone tell you it is too late. It is not too late. She stopped. She set the tintype back down on the lectern. The room was very quiet for a long moment, and then a woman in the third row, who Hadley would later learn was 68 years old and had driven 70 minutes to be there, began to applaud. The rest of the room followed, and the applause went on for long enough that Hadley had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep herself composed. Afterward, women lined up to speak with her. They told her their own stories in low, quick voices, the way people tell things they have not told often enough to have found the right words for. A woman whose husband had left after 41 years. A woman whose landlord had tripled her rent. A woman who had been told by her own children that she was too old to start anything new. A woman who had driven 80 minutes because she had read the original newspaper article 6 months ago and had cut it out and kept it in her kitchen drawer and had finally worked up the courage to come. Hadley listened to every one of them. She did not offer easy comfort. She told them what she actually believed, which was that the cage was the thing that had been thrown away, not them, that they were intact, that they had always been intact, that they had only been waiting for the particular darkness that would let them see themselves clearly. She drove home to Briar Road that night with the windows of her car down despite the October cold. The Missouri air moved through the car. The stars were out above the empty fields. She turned onto the gravel track she had come to know so well. Her headlights swept across the building she had built, the new windows, the new front door, the neat gravel path, the vegetable bed along the south wall, mostly empty now in October but cleared and turned and ready for the spring. She parked. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. She looked at the building. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Beatrice Harlan working by lamplight in a small wooden farmhouse on the same quarter-acre 135 years earlier, stitching something extraordinary into being with no guarantee that anyone would ever see it. She thought about Wendell hauling the kitchen table from a neighbor's garage sale 2 decades ago and not knowing it would outlast him by over a decade and travel to a gravel lot at the end of Briar Road and become the center of a life he could not have imagined. She thought about the small brass key worn smooth on the bow that she still kept in the small wooden box on her dresser, although the lock had long ago been replaced. She thought about Marcus Pemberton, who had sold the rest of his rental properties in July, who had left Maplewood entirely in August, who was, according to a piece of regional gossip Doris had brought to her in September, now divorced and living in a rented condominium in a suburb of St. Louis. She thought about what it meant to be thrown away and what it meant to discover in the process of surviving it that you were not what had been thrown away, that what had been thrown away was the cage, that you yourself were intact, that you had always been intact, waiting only for exactly this particular darkness to make you visible. She got out of the car. She walked up the gravel path she had laid stone by stone. She opened the door of the home she had built with her own hands. She stepped inside. The lamp on the kitchen table was on. The framed tintype of Beatrice Harlan was above it on the wall. The cabinet against the north wall held the 14 quilts she had decided to keep. The trapdoor in the floor was closed with its proper hinges and its new ring pull, and beneath it, the root cellar that had waited 135 years held now only the 4 museum-grade pieces Hadley had decided would stay with her until the day she could no longer care for them, after which they would go by terms of a clause she had drafted with her attorney in August to the Historical Society under Beatrice Harlan's name. She put the kettle on. She sat down at her mother's old kitchen table. She thought briefly, the way a person sometimes thinks briefly about the women who had brought her here, her mother, her grandmother, Beatrice Harlan 135 years removed and somehow closer than any of them, Doris, Cecile, Dr. Holloway, Dr. Talbot, Margaret Sutton, who had leaned across a county counter in November and whispered a single careful sentence that had turned out to be the loose thread of an entire history. She thought about the morning in November when she had stood on the sidewalk in front of the house on Cedar Lane with 2 suitcases in her hands and watched a black SUV drive away. She thought about who she had been that morning. She thought about who she was now. The kettle began to whistle. She got up to take it off the burner. The lamp on the kitchen table glowed warm and steady. The wind moved very quietly across the metal roof of her home. Outside, the Missouri stars were out in full above the small quarter-acre of ground that belonged to Hadley Thornquist, 75 years old, who had been told once that she was nothing and who had built from that particular kind of wrongness everything that she now was. She poured her tea. She sat back down. She looked at the photograph of Beatrice Harlan on the wall above her. She said very quietly into the warm, still air of her home, "Thank you, Beatrice." The lamp burned. The wind was quiet, and the night went on, and the stars wheeled slowly above central Missouri, and somewhere in the small, unmarked plot in the colored section of the Maplewood Public Cemetery, a woman who had waited 135 years to be properly named was named again by a 75-year-old widow who had been brought to her in the strangest way the world ever brings 2 women together across a century and a half and a piece of folded parchment, and who would carry her name forward now for whatever years remained in either of them.